The clock was ticking its last seconds of war. On a small Pacific island, a bomber crew waited for a voice, just one voice from their commander. One word from him, and history would have seen a third sun rise over Japan. But that word never came. Silence hung in the air, thick as heat, stretching from the runway to the laboratories an ocean away. The heat is physical, metallic, administrative. It shimmers over Northfield on Tinian as ground crews run their hands across aluminum skin and safety wire bolts that cannot afford to loosen. It glows inside the casting shops at Los Alamos, where a plutonium-gallium alloy is measured in micrometers and temperament. It hums along War Department teletypes that spit out schedules, forecasts, and directives. Field, lab, headquarters. The triangle tightens as calendars collapse into checklists. Every box ticked brings a weapon closer to flight. Every hour gained feels like a day cut from the war. By the morning after Nagasaki, Lieutenant General Leslie Groves could sketch the next step. Material for another implosion device existed. If machining held, if weather cooperated, if the B-29 crews remained on alert, a third bomb could be available for combat around 19 August, with more following in September and October. The pipeline was slender but real. Plutonium pits from New Mexico, high explosive assemblies routed through Kirtland Field, and Project Alberta technicians on Tinian who knew the ritual of hoists, torque, and safety pins. Timelines lived on clipboards, futures on those timelines. That momentum had been building for months. The late July target directives established the framework. Strike rapidly, select industrial centers with military value and large urban footprints, avoid overflight risks. Practice drops with orange-painted pumpkins tuned ballistics. Instrument ships rehearsed radiation sampling. Weather aircraft watched the Sea of Japan for the same cloud decks and crosswinds that had already turned Kokura into a ghosted target and redirected a mission toward Nagasaki. The third strike, if ordered, would follow the same choreography, hardened now by 2 uses and the chilling certainty that it would work. But planning existed beside politics. On 8th August, the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan, ripping open the strategic map of Manchuria. In Tokyo, ministers argued over terms, over the emperor's role, over the meaning of annihilation. In Washington, Harry S. Truman read the second bomb's report and considered the price of a third flash in a country that might already be moving towards surrender. The bomb simplified operations. It complicated statecraft. On 10 August, the president imposed a break. No further atomic bombs would be used without his express authorization. Physics did not stop. Policy took the driver's seat. Groves could keep the foundry going and the shipping lists warm. The 509th Composite Group could maintain aircraft and crews on hair-trigger readiness. Yet the next detonation now required a fresh, personal go. What sounded like a procedural note became the hinge of history, turning momentum into suspense. The suspense was crowded with work. Machinists chased tolerances. Metallurgists corrected surface flaws. Couriers covered flight plans with tarpaulins and secrecy. On the Marianas, armorers practiced assembly under air-conditioned canvas, guarding detonator chains as if they were living things. Radiomen updated frequency cards. Navigators sharpened approach headings. None of this guaranteed a mission. All of it made the distance between a signature in Washington and a bomb bay opening over Japan terrifyingly short. Then came signals that felt different than logistics. Through diplomatic channels, the Japanese hinted at acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration if the emperor's position could be preserved. The language was cautious, layered, and not yet a surrender. But it changed the atmosphere of the hours. A third detonation would no longer be the accelerator of a stalled war. It risked becoming the echo of a decision already forming in Tokyo, but not yet spoken aloud. Between 9 and 15 August, the corridor for a third mission opened and narrowed with every forecast and cabinet meeting. The Corps neared readiness. The crews stayed on the edge of sleep. The weather at Kokura and Niigata shifted like a moral argument. The longer the pause, the heavier the political meaning of another blast became. What on 7th of August might have been called urgency began by 12th of August to look like redundancy. These 10 days, tarmac, laboratory, and cabinet room, are where the atomic age first encountered restraint. A weapon can be ready. A target can be marked. A flight can be briefed. And yet the most consequential order can be the one that is not given. The runway lamps still point downrange as the calendar flips toward 19th of August. Long before the Third Corps was poured, the Target Committee and the orders of 25 July 1945 had set the operational chessboard. Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, and Nagasaki in that order, as soon as weather will permit after about 3 August. Those directives hardened into training, logistics, and checklists on Tinian. Crews practiced weight and balance for Fat Man assemblies. Project Alberta refined the assembly sequence so a crate arriving at the airfield could become a functioning bomb in hours, not days. The mission profiles were drawn with ruler straight lines and conditional branches. Visual drops preferred. Radar only if ordered. Abort criteria clear and unforgiving. The choreography was the point. Precision on paper made speed possible in the air. After Hiroshima, the second mission, Operation Centerboard 2, aimed first at Kokura. Haze, drifting smoke from prior raids, and timing pushed the bombardier past the primary toward the secondary. Nagasaki. The lesson landed hard. Weather had veto power. For any third attack, planners looked again at the short list. Kokura's arsenal works and ordnance depots offered a strong case for primary status. Niigata, a northern port and industrial node, offered rail choke points and psychological reach. But the calendar clarified the constraint. The Third Corps would not be ready before mid-August. The best window looked like the 19th, conditioned by assembly and meteorology. The target boards could be bold. The sky could still say no. Meanwhile, test and training drops continued. The orange-painted pumpkins, inert Fat Man-shaped bombs, trained crews to manage drag, ballistics, and timing. Particular assemblies earned nicknames and numbers. F-13 and F-18 were evaluation workhorses. F-31 was a fully acceptable operational set. F-32 failed inspection when a high-explosive block cracked during handling, a reminder that chemistry sometimes says no to strategy. Armorers learned to distrust perfection and to re-verify every detonator lead and lens alignment as if the last inspection had been an illusion. The margin for error in implosion design was thin. The moral margin for an atomic strike was thinner. The chain stretched back to the mainland. Components moved from Kirtland Field under a braid of secrecy and speed. Each leg of the journey had its own fragility. A weather delay in New Mexico, a loading accident in the Marianas, a misread forecast over the Sea of Japan. Planners tried to build redundancy into every step, spare fuses flown ahead, duplicate tools staged in assembly huts, alternate runways held open. Yet the system could not be made invulnerable. It relied on narrow weather corridors and narrow political corridors, both of which could close with little warning. Commanders, for their part, kept parallel pressure on Japan with conventional means. B-29 groups targeted rail yards, oil facilities, and remaining aircraft production, seeking to starve movement and erase capacity. The submarine blockade constricted imports. Leaflets warned of ruin while radio traffic searched for any signal that fear was turning into policy. In that atmosphere, the atomic program's momentum looked like one more gear in a machine already grinding toward an end, but a gear with outsized torque, able to yank the narrative forward by months in a single mission. By 10th of August, the question hovering over every planning table was not, can the third bomb fly, but should it? And who would say when? The President's requirement for explicit authorization recalibrated authority. Groves could advise. Theater commanders could plan. But the Go Code now lived at the White House. The target list did not vanish. It simply lost inevitability. The boards on Tinian still showed Kokura and Niigata with grease pencil circles. The weather brief still predicted cloud layers at 20,000 feet, and visibility that could swing from clear to impossible in minutes. The crews still rehearsed their turns, climbs, and bomb run speeds. Yet each repetition underscored the new truth. Preparation was necessary, not sufficient. There was also the intelligence picture. Signals from Tokyo suggested a search for a way out that preserved the imperial institution. Allied intercepts and diplomatic summaries delivered fragments, enough to imply movement, not enough to let planners bet lives on words. A third detonation could harden a decision already leaning towards surrender. It could also harden resistance if interpreted as proof that negotiation was meaningless. Strategy had to read psychology as closely as it read maps, so timetables became arguments. The logistics staff spoke in hours and days. Meteorologists spoke in ceilings and visibility. Aircrew spoke in fuel margins and bomb run stability. Civilians in Washington spoke in consequences that would echo for decades. When those languages finally converged, they would either point a crew toward a familiar route, north to Kyushu, right turn to the aiming point, or they would point the world toward a microphone in Tokyo. The plane could be ready in time. The question was whether time still demanded a plane. At Los Alamos, metallurgists worked around the clock to cast a fresh plutonium-gallium sphere, an implosion pit like Nagasaki's, roughly 6.2 kilograms in mass, about 9 centimeters across, nickel-coated to tame corrosion and ease handling. The shape had to be exact. Any asymmetry would rob the shockwave of its precision and bleed the core's path to criticality. The foundry heat left a tang in the air, a mix of oil, flux, and worry. Micrometers clicked like metronomes. Lathe-shaved curls of metal thin as paper, each one a record of a surface brought closer to perfect. Casting was only the first act. The core halves required pressing, bonding, and machining to tolerances that lived at the edge of wartime production. Metallurgists chased defects with radiography. Surface finish had to meet a quiet standard that could not be seen by eye, but would be heard later as a uniform implosion. The explosive lens blocks that would drive the inward shock required their own perfection. Precisely layered high explosives and wave-shaping geometry that a cracked casting, like the doomed F-32, could betray without warning. Implosion did not reward almost. It punished it. Scheduling lived in the margins. The pit would remain stateside until the last responsible moment. The explosive assemblies would move forward first. That choice balanced security, safety, and schedule. It also acknowledged the bottleneck, plutonium. The laboratories could not afford a handling accident or a shipping mishap. Couriers rehearsed chains of custody. Crates were mapped to aircraft with weight and temperature constraints noted in thick penciled margins. Even with the mainland to Marianas conveyor understood from earlier missions, the final handoffs remained delicate. One nick, one dropped tool, one moment of complacency could trade weeks of work for a line in an incident report. While the machine shops counted thousandths, the calendar added hours of geopolitics. On 8 August, the Soviet entry into the war split attention. Field reports from Manchuria suggested a collapsing front. In Tokyo, the Supreme Council moved through a sequence of near breaks and deadlocks, weighing surrender with conditions against annihilation without them. On the mesas of New Mexico, scientists kept to task, aware that news from Asia might wipe their deadline away, or bring it forward with terrifying emphasis. The paradox of the Third Corps was that its readiness could make the political calculus either simpler or impossible. Inside Groves's daily memoranda, the language was clinical. Dates, quantities, percent complete. Inside the lab, the mood was taut and human. Men who had spent years solving hydrodynamics problems now handled metal with a craftsman's superstition, tapping fixtures twice, rechecking gauges, keeping notebooks as if words could absorb error. The device would be a near twin of the one used at Nagasaki, but no weapon in this chain could be called routine. Each was an argument with physics that had to end in a single decisive yes. Every hour saved in machining looked like a day cut from the war. That belief gave speed its own moral gravity. Yet as the third pit approached readiness, mid-August by the best estimate, the question shifted from schedule to purpose. Would a detonation on or around 19 August compel what 2 bombs in a Soviet declaration had not? Or would it scar another city after the decision to surrender had already been taken privately? The difference between those outcomes could lie in the span of a cabinet meeting, the phrasing of a diplomatic cable, a vote cast in a sealed room. By the end of 13th of August, the safest move was to wait on shipment. The pit could be finished or nearly so by the 16th. The air crews could manage a runway-to-target timeline that put the weapon over Kyushu within days. But the strategic temperature had changed. Messages from Tokyo grew less conditional. The Emperor's role moved from obstacle to instrument. Planners could read the signs. So could the President. In the stillness before a decision, the Corps remained where it had been born. The last mile was not across the Pacific, but across a desk in Washington. This was the quiet paradox of the third bomb. The closer it came to perfection, the less necessary it seemed. The craftsmanship that made it possible also made its use avoidable by shrinking the time between readiness and restraint. When history turned, there would be no dramatic scramble. No aborted takeoff. No last-second recall. There would only be an unused core in a lab and a line in a memo that meant the war's end would be spoken, not detonated. The plane is ready. Is the order? On Tinian's north field, that sentence summed up 1,000 man-hours of preparation. Aluminum glinted in the morning light. Heat shimmered across pierced steel planking. Fuel bowsers crawled like beetles between revetments. A crew could turn a B-29 in hours. Paul Tibbets had been directed to stage back to Kirtland earlier to coordinate assemblies. Curtis LeMay's staff tightened route charts and bomb run parameters while weather ships sampled air over the Sea of Japan. The checklists bloomed with specifics: bomb bay locks, arming wires, intervalometers, oxygen checks. The mission could be built piece by piece like a bridge, then crossed in one irretrievable sprint. Final targeting discussions still placed Kokura and Niigata among the likely options. Kokura's complex, with its arsenal works, coke ovens, and ordnance plants, carried a military logic and a symbolic weight, a center of war-making capacity. Niigata promised a port's vulnerability and the psychological reach of a northern strike. The architecture would mirror Nagasaki's: a strike aircraft, instrument planes for blast readings, and strict rules against unnecessary overflight. The aiming point would be chosen for visibility and effect. Altitudes and headings would bend to weather as much as to design, but the 9 August mission had left scars in the lesson book. Smoke, drift, and cloud brought Kokura beyond acceptable visual standards. The bombardier shifted to the secondary, and history slid a few dozen miles southwest. In the days after, planners reran the film. They refined minimums for visibility, rechecked alternate headings, and recommitted to visual confirmation. The point was not micromanagement. It was a recognition that the margin for error in atomic bombing was moral, as well as ballistic. A miss was not just a technical failure. It was a failure of intent. On 13th of August, with surrender movement accelerating, Groves decided to hold the core rather than ship it forward. On paper, it was an administrative act, one line in a logistics log. In practice, it allowed politics to catch up with physics. If Tokyo hardened, shipment could proceed. If Tokyo bent, the weapon would be where it could be uncrated for experiments rather than for war. The runway stayed busy, but the tempo shifted from countdown to contingency. Airfield life still followed its rituals. Armorers inventoried detonators by serial number, then inventoried them again. Weather briefings ticked through cloud layers, winds aloft, and expected haze from burning cities. Navigators checked celestial fixes against Lauren plots and fuel curves against alternate strips. The men could do everything right, every checklist, every calculation, and still depend on a cosmic roll of haze and wind at the end of the bomb run. That humility lived beneath the confidence of the checklists. Precision met chance at 30,000 feet. Meanwhile, conventional air raids and blockade pressure continued. B-29s struck rail lines and oil facilities. Submarines choked what remained of coastal shipping. Radio Tokyo changed tone. Intercepted messages shifted from defiance toward calculation. A third atomic strike would have landed in that moving conversation, adding shock to pressure. Whether it would add clarity was less certain by the hour. Then the microphone in Tokyo began to matter more than the bomb racks on Tinian. As the Emperor's advisors weighed surrender, the runway lights lost their meaning as arrows and became simply maintenance chores. The crews still practiced, the instruments still hummed. Yet the mission's logic thinned. What had felt inevitable now felt contingent, even fragile. When signals became commitments, the long geometry from New Mexico to the Marianas to a target city loosened its hold. The plane was still ready. The order never came. In its place came a different kind of choreography. Stand-down procedures, inventory seals, and the quiet relief of men allowed to sleep. The distance between assigned authorization and an open bomb bay had been measured, rehearsed, and proven. It would now be archived. That is the hinge we wanted to see up close. Not only how a mission would have launched, but how it failed to launch for reasons outside the airfield fence. The runway was a corridor through which politics would have flowed into physics. When the politics changed, when hints of acceptance solidified into surrender terms, the corridor closed without drama. A single administrative choice to hold a core in New Mexico on 13th of August became the physical embodiment of restraint. It kept a bomb off a ship, kept a flight plan in a drawer, and kept the third detonation from becoming the loudest answer to a question already answered. The pivotal lever was pulled far from airstrips and assembly huts. In Washington, in the compressed hours after Nagasaki, the center of gravity moved from technicians and navigators to a single civilian decision-maker. On 10th of August 1945, Harry S. Truman directed that no further atomic bombs be used without his express authorization. It sounded procedural, almost clerical, like an extra signature added to a form. In practice, it redrew the map of authority. The Manhattan Engineer District could finish cores. Project Alberta could rehearse assembly. The 509th Composite Group could hold crews on alert. None of them could cross the final threshold unless the president reopened it. The instruction ran down the chain with military neatness. General George C. Marshall annotated the guidance, ensuring the language left no ambiguity for theater commanders accustomed to acting on standing orders. That mattered, because momentum was already a character in this story. Groves had told his superiors that another implosion bomb could be ready around 19th August, and that production curves pointed to 2 or 3 more by September, 3 more by October. The pipeline, fragile but functioning, seemed ready to convert laboratory craft into a series of combat sorties. The presidential break did not destroy that machine. It put a hand on its throttle. Inside the War Department, staff officers read the directive against a changing strategic calendar. The Soviet Union had declared war on Japan on 8th of August, exploding the assumption that Tokyo could bargain for time on a single front. American naval blockade was starving cities of raw materials and fuel. Conventional bombing, brutal in its own right, had erased districts faster than city maps could be updated. Within this storm, the atomic weapon had already demonstrated its power twice. The third strike, by that logic, would be confirmation and compulsion. But the directive asked a different question. Would a third blast shorten the war measurably, or would it simply repeat a message already heard in Tokyo and in the shattered neighborhoods of 2 cities? Truman's caution did not come from softness about war. It sprang from a recognition that the bomb was more than an explosive. It was a political instrument with meanings that would echo into peace. Each additional use had a diplomatic cost, a post-war consequence, a moral residue. As he required personal authorization, he signaled to allies and adversaries that the United States would not allow routine to govern atomic force. It would not be merely another line on a daily air tasking order. It would be a decision with the president's fingerprints on it. Meanwhile, the machinery continued to hum. Groves kept the laboratories running because stopping would waste scarce plutonium and fragile momentum. In New Mexico, metallurgists pursued tolerances as if the directive did not exist, because their schedule could not depend on political weather. On Tinian, the assembly crews inventoried detonators, timing units, and strongback fixtures. Armorers checked the hoists that would lower a finished bomb into a bay. Air crews reviewed approach charts and emergency divert fields. Everyone knew the rule had changed. No one knew which way the next phone call would swing. That uncertainty thickened as the intelligence picture evolved. Through Swiss and Swedish intermediaries, the Japanese probed for terms that preserved the imperial institution. The messages were cautious, indirect, and surrounded by hawks who wanted one more roll of the dice on the battlefield. The bomb had already altered their calculus by showing that geography offered no sanctuary. The Soviets' move into Manchuria added a second shock. The presidential break ensured that the third shock would not land by inertia. It would land only as a chosen act if those signals failed. There is a particular tension in those 5 days from 10 to 15 August. In one future, a corps leaves Los Alamos, a crate crosses a runway on Northfield, and a bombardier checks a cool, circular sight glass against an aiming point over Kokura or Niigata. In the other, a recording of an emperor's voice flows through a nation unused to hearing it, and men on islands and in foxholes lower their weapons while the air remains empty. The directive created the space in which that second future could arrive without competition from the first. It gave diplomacy 5 unbombed days. By concentrating responsibility at the top, the order also foreshadowed the atomic age that would follow. Civilian control tightened around a technology born from physics but freighted with politics. Presidents would come to view nuclear decisions as singular, not serial. Strategists would build doctrines to hold those decisions inside institutions durable enough to withstand panic and accident. In August 1945, those decades of policy were unborn. There was only a note, a chain of custody for a corps and a waiting runway. The last effect of the presidential break was psychological. For the crews who had proven the concept at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, readiness without release was an unfamiliar posture. It did not diminish their achievement. It shifted their role from execution to deterrent presence, even before that word belonged to the nuclear lexicon. For the scientists, it translated months of urgent problem-solving into a pause that felt like a test of patience as much as of ethics. For the president, it turned the abstract language of authority into a simple habit. Ask again, consider again, decide again. That habit, formed in a week, would become the lead sentence in the long story of nuclear restraint. When the microphone in Tokyo finally came alive, the directive had done its work. No late-night scramble was needed. No recall order sent across open ocean. The third bomb remained potential, not event. At noon on 15th of August, radios across Japan carried the Gyokuan Hoso, the emperor's voice, announcing acceptance of the Potsdam terms. The sound was strained by poor transmission and elevated diction, but the meaning was unmistakable. For the first time, the head of state told his nation to lay down arms. In the Pacific, the order ran like a wind that blows out a line of fires. On Tinian, men stepped back from bomb hoists and logged inventory instead. The Third Corps, still stateside, did not board a flight. A mission brief gave way to a stand-down checklist. In the quiet that followed, the canceled path became legible in paperwork. The pit casting was complete or near complete by 16th August, a testament to the tempo at Los Alamos. The earliest plausible strike window, given assembly, fusing, and meteorology, clustered around 19th August. Candidate cities remained those already scripted by the 25 July order. Kokura prominent, Niigata plausible, and weather permitting, a visual drop preferred. Those entries would not be erased. They would be filed. A war that had trained men to think hour by hour ended for many of them as a sequence of tidy forms. General Leslie Groves, reading the atmosphere as carefully as cloud reports, canceled shipment. That single administrative entry sealed the third detonation's fate. The Corps stayed where it had been born, in a landscape of mesas and laboratories whose fences had become the de facto front line of atomic history. In retrospect, it is tempting to read inevitability into this moment, as if surrender had always been the only outcome after 2 bombs and a Soviet declaration. The archive says otherwise. The margin was days. The risk of a third blast landing in the pause between decision and announcement was real. Restraint converted that risk into a lesson. That lesson at first was logistical. The apparatus that had moved secrets across a continent pivoted to peacetime tasks, experiments, measurements, controlled demonstrations. Scientists who had argued for urgency in wartime now argued for caution in the laboratory, because the danger had shifted from enemy aircraft to their own hands. The unused Corps acquired an informal nickname, Rufus, and then a reputation that would make a second name stick. In late August 1945, during a criticality demonstration, an accident exposed a physicist to a lethal burst of neutron radiation. Months later, in May 1946, another accident during a similar experiment produced the same tragic end. The community began to call the medal the Demon Corps. Those deaths, separate from combat yet inseparable from the weapon's nature, reframed the meaning of the third bomb's non-use. A city had been spared, but the danger had not gone dormant. It had moved indoors into rooms where tungsten shims, screwdriver blades, and beryllium reflectors determined whether an experiment remained a demonstration or became a disaster. The line between mastery and harm was as thin in peacetime as in war. That recognition deepened a culture of safety, codifying procedures for critical assemblies, forbidding the improvisations that wartime pressure had sometimes excused. Meanwhile, the political reading of the unused weapon began to harden. To allies, the pause after Nagasaki signaled that the United States would not default to atomic force to solve every military problem. To adversaries, it hinted at both capacity and caution, a combination that would define deterrence debates for decades. To the American public, emerging details confirmed a portrait of a president who had used the bomb twice to end a war, and then refused to use it again when surrender loomed. That narrative, simplified by time, nevertheless contained the essence of what had happened. Capability governed by decision, not by inertia. Within the services, there was introspection of a different kind. Air planners studied the weather failures and near failures of 9 August, and refined doctrines for visual versus radar bombing. Logistic officers examined the pipeline from Kirtland to Tinian to understand how to compress timelines without inviting accidents. The Navy and Army assessed how blockade and conventional bombing had interacted with atomic shock to compress Japan's options. The third bomb, by not flying, became a control group of a sort, a demonstration of what pressure without a third detonation could achieve when combined with diplomacy and a second front in Manchuria. On a personal level, the stand-down distributed a complex relief. Crews who had readied themselves for a mission unlike any other in aviation found that sleep returned without the weight of a destination city. Scientists who had lived at the edge of fatigue learned that their next deadlines would be written in peacetime units, weeks and months, rather than hours. The brief stillness of August, before occupation tribunals and reconstruction began, was as close to quiet as the atomic program would ever know. A surrender speech beats a mission brief is more than a clever line. It is a capsule of the moment when words outran machinery. The machinery did not vanish. It turned toward a different frontier and discovered its own perils there. What precisely lay on the table when the war stopped moving? Start with Tinian. There were implosion assemblies and high-explosive blocks stacked in guarded huts, their serial numbers logged, their condition inspected after every voyage. At least one operational assembly, designated F-31, stood ready for mating with a pit. Spares were available to hedge against handling damage and the unforgiving geometry of lens blocks. Hoists, strongbacks, and torquey wrenches waited for the ritual that would join metal and chemistry into a single, monstrous unity. On the mainland, a third plutonium pit was finishing or finished by 16th August, its tolerances achieved by machinists who read measurements with a craftsman's suspicion of their own eyes. Add the air side. The 509th Composite Group had crews trained in weight and balance peculiarities of the Fat Man form. Navigators had route cards for runs to Kyushu and along the Sea of Japan. Weather aircraft had practiced profiles to probe the exact ceilings and visibility that would make or break a visual drop. The lessons of 9th August had been absorbed. Kokura could vanish beneath smoke in an hour. A secondary target could become destiny, because a cloud arrived 20 minutes early. Those lessons increased technical humility without erasing operational confidence. Now the calendar. Hiroshima fell on 6th August. Nagasaki on 9th August. Production and shipping curves suggested a third strike was feasible around 19th August if the Corps moved promptly, and weather cooperated. That implied a campaign cadence between 7 and 10 days per atomic sortie, conditioned by the slowest leg, finishing and moving the plutonium pit. Groves's forecast, delivered in the clipped idiom of staff work, promised 2 or 3 bombs in September and 3 in October if the pipeline held. The precision of those projections made the next fact more striking. A microphone in Tokyo changed more than a delivery schedule ever could. Against the operational ledger, set the diplomatic timeline. On 8th August, the Soviets entered the war. Their offensive into Manchuria shattered any remaining Japanese expectation of a controllable stalemate. Cabinet debates in Tokyo lurched between factions, but the emperor's voice, usually distant from policy detail, began to matter in a new way. Intercepts and diplomatic summaries reached Washington with the texture of a weather forecast that suggests rain soon, but cannot swear to it. The president's order on 10th August created a pause exactly long enough for those clouds to turn into a storm of decision. Consider the arithmetic of damage and pressure. Conventional raids had erased districts at a scale measured in square miles. Submarines had strangled supply. 2 atomic detonations added a new kind of terror, 1 device, 1 city, and announced that the United States could now destroy by quality as well as by quantity. A third detonation delivered 10 days later would have reinforced the message that there was no safe interval for regrouping. It might also have been interpreted as impatience in the face of surrender, or as dismissal of the emperor-centered formula that Japanese moderates clung to as a path out. The math of bombs versus days met the math of psychology, and the latter carried the final column. Inside the program, numbers bow to tolerances. An implosion core that is 1 machining step from complete is not a weapon. A crate that sits in New Mexico rather than on a Marianas dock represents days of delay that only policy can erase. Forecasts of 2-3 by September, 3 by October are true only if nothing cracks. No aircraft is delayed by weather. No stevedore misinterprets a seal. and no accident interrupts a string of perfect handoffs. The system had achieved 2 uses in 3 days at the beginning. Repeating that performance would always be harder because each success tightened safety margins, and each day's delay gave politics room to act. On the target boards, the circle around Kokura remained thick. Niigata's port and industry kept it in view. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, already struck, were off the list in moral as well as operational terms. The preference for visual bombing made meteorology a co-author of history. Cloud layers at 20,000 feet, haze from conventional fires, and the geometry of the sun's angle at the planned hour could hold more sway over the aiming point than any argument on a target committee. Precision met atmosphere and accepted that atmosphere could win. The inventory on the eve of surrender then reads like this: assemblies at Tinian, a nearly ready pit at Los Alamos, trained crews, defined routes, and a schedule that could have produced one more detonation in late August and several more by autumn. Opposite that, a political momentum that outpaced metallurgy. The arithmetic of war, sorties, blocks, cores, was overtaken by the arithmetic of decision. Signals, conditions, acceptance. The third bomb ceased to be a problem of engineering. It became a question of purpose, and when purpose changed, the numbers lost their claim to inevitability. The road not taken left a complicated legacy. The unused core did not sit silently on a shelf. It became a protagonist in the dangerous birth of atomic peacetime. On 21 August 1945, during a criticality experiment at Los Alamos, a physicist was fatally irradiated when tungsten carbide bricks around the core created a momentary supercritical configuration. The event was sudden, almost soundless, and lethal. Months later, on 21 May 1946, in another demonstration, a brief uncontrolled excursion occurred when a beryllium reflector slipped, closing the gap around the core. The second physicist died 9 days later. The metal that had been held back from war acquired a reputation and soon a name: the Demon Core. Those accidents did not occur in isolation. They were artifacts of a transition from wartime urgency to peacetime method. Demonstrations that had once been tolerated as rough, persuasive proofs for military observers were now recognized as unacceptable risks. The community wrote rules in response: hands-off fixtures for reflectors, interlocks, distance tools, and rigid sign-offs. Improvisation, which thrives in projects born under deadlines, became a suspect habit. In this sense, the third bomb's non-use produced a different kind of casualty. Complacency met physics and lost, then forced a culture change that would save lives none of those early experimenters would ever meet. The material itself entered a new economy. The core, never dropped over a city, was eventually melted and recycled, its atoms diffused into other experiments and training assemblies. It did not vanish. It dissolved into the bloodstream of a program that would define the early Cold War. Reactors multiplied. Isotope production found medical and industrial uses. Weapons designs diverged into families whose acronyms would populate briefing charts for decades. The lesson of August 1945, that political hands must remain on scientific triggers, became a quiet assumption behind all of it. Truman's 10 Taus. August requirement for personal authorization hardened into doctrine. Civilian control of nuclear use was reaffirmed in law and in custom. War plans evolved to treat atomic weapons as instruments of last resort or of strategic signaling rather than as mere multipliers for conventional campaigns. The vocabulary of the next era, deterrent, second strike, fail-safe, grew from the seed planted when one president said, in effect, that the next atomic flash would not occur because a shipment happened to arrive or a crew happened to be rested. It would occur, if at all, because a president accepted the consequences. Abroad, the example carried mixed readings. To friends, restraint after the second use suggested limits. To potential adversaries, it suggested that the United States could stop itself as well as others, that a policy boundary existed inside the capability to destroy. The perception mattered. Deterrence depends not only on what one can do, but on what one is believed willing to do. August 1945 drew an early line. Willingness is conditional. That conditionality shaped crises from Berlin to Korea to Cuba, guiding decisions that often turned on whether a limited conventional loss was preferable to an uncontrollable nuclear risk. There is also a human ledger. Thousands of aircrew did not fly a third atomic mission. Tens of thousands in Japan did not experience a third atomic blast. Two scientists at Los Alamos died in rooms where the line between demonstration and detonation proved thinner than expected. On both sides of the ocean, lives were altered by a weapon that remained possible but unused. It is not moral arithmetic in the sense of balancing equal terms. It is a recognition that consequences migrate. When a city is spared, responsibility does not rest. It relocates to those who keep dangerous knowledge from turning on its keepers. Over time, the memory of the third bomb settled into a corner of the narrative, less known than the names of two cities, more present in the technical lore of a community that measures danger with slide rules and stopwatches. Yet its presence is felt whenever leaders discuss thresholds. The unused weapon is a reminder that the most significant choice can be to decline the easy confirmation of power. Restraint is not a void. It is a policy with content, a statement that capability without purpose is not a program but a temptation. If you've made it this far, you're one of us, searching for the truth behind the headlines and the courage behind the silence. Subscribe to the channel, and let's keep exploring the hidden wars, secret operations, and untold fates that shape the world we live in.